Hey everyone, I'm Majiin and welcome in to World Tour Weekly, your one-stop shop for all competitive flesh and blood news. This is going to be the last episode until after Pro Tour Singapore, since next week I'll be busy being in Singapore, so we have a lot to talk about. Let's get into it. Now with national season officially over, we have a much better idea of what we can expect to show up at the Pro Tour. Before we get into that though, let's take a moment to celebrate the final group of new national champions and this week's weekend winners. As with before, I'm going to try my absolute hardest on the names, but I know I'm going to mess up a few of them, so I'm sorry in advance. So without any further ado, here are your final national champions for this year. Filippo Barbani won Italy's national championship with Victor Goldmane. Jonil Ibasco took Azalea to a first place finish in the Philippines. Wojtek Klimczyk won in Poland with Verdance. Chong Eun-guok took down South Korea's national event with Dash.io. Alexis Tidovs won in Latvia with Levaya. I haven't even seen a Levaya in months, so I was very surprised, but pretty happy to see her take down a nationals. Nikita Lasma won in Estonia with Prism. Ireland's national championship was won by Dylan Thompson, piloting Arachne Slip Through the Cracks. Fun fact, this is his third year in a row winning Ireland's national championship. That's pretty impressive. Adam Nazaros won in Hungary with Florian. Florin Christian Lagen piloted Slippy to victory in Austria. Norway's event was taken down by Stefan Bergo Jensen on Acilio. Winner of the Best Picture award goes to Osmar Bravo after winning Mexico Nationals on Slippy. Alvaro Francisco Toledano Benito won Spain's national championship on Dash Inventor Extraordinaire. Lo Yi Jin won in Malaysia with Azalea. Angelos Maxillares won in Greece with Kano. Seems like there's a lot of wizards around this week. Marion Abrantes won in Portugal piloting Syndra. Hong Kong's event was won by Ninja Master Pudding Tam, also on Syndra. Niklas Bensten won in Sweden, also on Syndra. Cal Kivalati, otherwise known as Yuto on YouTube, took down Finland's national championship with Acilio. Xavier McLean became the two-time Japanese national champion, piloting Slippy this time around. And Justin Lim won in Australia with Kasai. Congratulations to all of our new, and some returning, national champions. Now that we've covered this week's winners and what they won with, let's talk a little bit more about what the meta looks like as a whole in this week's Metagame Minute. Let's start by going over all the heroes that won this weekend. We have 4 Arachne Slip Through the Cracks, 3 Syndra, 2 Azalea, 2 Acilio, 1 Dash.io, 1 Dash.ie, Florian, Kano, 1 Kasai, 1 Levaya, 1 Prism, 1 Verdance, and 1 Victor Goldmane. The most shocking part of this list to me isn't actually that the Levaya won, it's more that Gravy Bones didn't win a single nationals this weekend. Throughout this national season, it's been mostly a story of Gravy Bones and what decks combat Gravy Bones, like Syndra. Now that it's the final week of events before the Pro Tour, Mr. Bones is nowhere to be found. This could mean that players have gotten better about playing against him, or that his natural predators are a little bit too popular for him to thrive. Syndra continues to do very well, which shouldn't be much of a surprise, but I wouldn't classify her as best deck. That title, I think, undoubtedly has to go to Arachne Slip Through the Cracks. The deck is good into basically every other deck in the top of the meta, and their main counters like Florian or Arachne Marionette struggle into some of the other popular decks in the format, making them really difficult brings. It really feels like this deck is perfectly suited towards the meta that we currently find ourselves in, but only time will tell if that will continue to be true during the Pro Tour. Now, Wizards had a very good weekend, particularly Acilio. This deck's been on a lot of people's radar ever since the new shock came out, but I think this is the week where players finally start to listen to what Acilio players have been saying for a while. This deck is the real deal. I think that the main thing holding back Acilio from being more popular and seeing more success is that the deck is monstrously difficult to play optimally. Well, that and maybe Azalea, which I definitely thought was going to be gone by now, but yeah. Speaking of decks hitting Living Legend, Dash Inventor Extraordinaire finally limped over the 1,000 point line and is no longer legal in Classic Constructed. I don't think this is going to affect the Pro Tour meta in any significant way, except for maybe the 2 whole players who plan to bring her. Alright, we've gone over the meta for this week, but everyone is obviously already looking towards next week at the Pro Tour. This episode's going to be a little bit different than normal in that I'm going to spend the majority of the time talking about my personal feelings about the meta and my opinions on it. Let's start with my initial impressions for the meta, specifically for the event. There are a few things that I believe, or I think that a lot of others believe, that are going to shape kind of the initial impressions of the meta, and then I have some thoughts based on those. The first one is that Pro Tours and higher level events, the meta tends to coalesce a little bit more solidly than you would see at something smaller like a Nationals. Players are highly incentivized to pick decks that they think can actually win them the event, so you see a lot more players gravitate to what are considered the best decks. Leading off on that, I think that Slippy is probably the best deck in the format, and I think a lot of people know it. Due to how the deck functions and its matchup tables, if you're looking to counter it, I don't think there's really much you can do without putting yourself at the risk of running into atrocious matchups. Pick a deck like Florian to combat Slippy, and you might run into a room full of Verdances and Kanos. I do think that this will mean that a lot of players are going to bring Slippy for the event, and I think that this will have a lot of ramifications on what others bring as well. Taking a deck into this field that gets absolutely demolished by the Assassin would probably be not the smartest move. Alright, another big thing is that I think Gravy Bones is real and you should absolutely expect to run into him. I know this is really simple and obvious on the surface, but it seems like just about everyone is taking the Gravy Bones matchup into consideration first when building or testing for their decks. I imagine that this means that we'll end up seeing a lot of decks that have perceived good matchups into Gravy Bones, like Slippy and Syndra. So, in short, I expect the 3 most represented decks in the room to be Slippy, Gravy Bones, and Syndra. All of them are more or less known quantities, though this isn't super surprising. This does bring me to my first hot take of the video, though, which is that I don't think Syndra is quite as good as her amount of national wins would suggest. I understand that that's not really provocative enough language for a true hot take, so let me try that again. I believe that Syndra is basically Slippy, but worse in almost every single way that matters. They fill a very similar spot in the meta, being a fast redline aggro deck that punishes you for not blocking. The difference is that Slippy blocks very well and has loads more disruption, all while dealing the same or even more damage. The only times that Syndra has better matchups than Slippy is against decks that I don't expect to see a ton of, like Florian. It doesn't mean she isn't strong, I just don't think she gives you anything that Slippy doesn't offer but better. Now, moving on from my Syndra ranting, the Ira Armory deck is going to release this week with some really powerful cards included like Enact Vengeance and Okana Scar Wraps. While I do think that Ira is probably insane into Gravy Bones, I don't think that she's particularly well suited for this meta. I also don't think the players will have enough time to put together properly tuned lists for this event. I could definitely see a deck like Ira doing well, but I'm not sure if I would want to bring it into a field full of Slippies. Now, if you expect the field to be like 25% Gravy Bones, then it's an entirely different story, and Ira seems like a pretty reasonable pick. But that's not really the field I expect to see. Instead, I think we're going to see a lot of diverse decks do very well at this tournament. Not only are Slippy, Gravy, and Syndra going to be there, but Verdance, Prism, Acilio, Kano, Arachne Marionette, Kasai, Dorinthia, Fang, Azalea. They're all going to be there, and all of these decks can win a tournament. While I do think that some of these are less likely than others to win the tournament, it is cool that you can bring so many decks and still see success. Alright, now moving on to my favorite topic, me. I am likely to bring one of 3 decks for this event. The first one is Verdance, which I think you all probably expected. The second one is Acilio, which I think has a lot of pretty good matchups and is kind of underappreciated still. And the third one is a secret deck that my buddy Pankaj over at Arsenal Pass cooked up. I'm not going to tell you what it is quite yet because some of my teammates might bring it and I want to keep it a secret, but I can tell you that it's very spicy, and it's not a hero that won a national event. I know it's probably surprising for people not to hear Kano on that list, but I cannot stand playing Kano into Slippy when they have AB3 Spell Void 3 or into Prism. Even without taking that into consideration, the current way that Kano is incentivized to play is not something I really enjoy. He has to blind flip off the top a lot more often than I would like, and it feels more like I'm just rolling the dice than setting up some grand strategic play. I can't tell you how many times I've needed the card on top to deal any amount of arcane damage to win the game, just to flip Potion of Deja Vu or Kindle and lose. I do think that Kano has a lot of very good matchups, and I think he blows people out of the water. The issue is that you're signing up to automatically lose a couple of games in the event, either to your own deck or to the Prism player that you ran into. As I'm growing as a player, I'm trying to move further and further away from decks with such polarizing matchups like that. I don't want to have to take any free losses in a tournament. Or at least that's what I tell myself before I lock in a different wizard. Alright, now that I've rambled about my general thoughts for a while, let's put my money where my mouth is and give you my Pro Tour Singapore top 8 prediction. In the top 8 of Pro Tour Singapore, I expect there to be 1 copy of Gravy Bones, 1 Wizard, 3 copies of Slippy, 1 Syndra, 1 Prism, and 1 Warrior. I suspect the Wizard is most likely going to be Verdance or Acilio rather than Kano. Not that I think Kano is so much worse in this format than the other Wizards, I just think that Kano players have historically not been the best at draft. Despite what the numbers say, I also don't think Slippy is head and shoulders above the rest in the format, but I do think a lot of very strong players are going to bring them, and it doesn't seem to have any terrible matchups. The Warrior, in my estimation, is most likely to be Kasai. It could technically be like a Dawnblade Dorinthia or Fang, but at least we can all agree that it's not going to be Olympia. Alright, that's all I got for this one. Make sure that you tune into the broadcast to, I don't know, see how the Pro Tour goes or something, but more importantly, to see how my predictions turned out. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Majiin, and I'll see you next time on World Tour Weekly.